Okay, so before I go into introducing our speaker for today, I'm going to quickly go over the Zoom housekeeping rules and plug a special event that we have going on that tomorrow that I do not want you all to miss. So today's session will be recorded and the recording will be sent out to every registered guest at the conclusion of the session. We ask that you mute yourself during the presentation, but utilize the chat to ask questions and engage throughout. There will be a time where you will be encouraged to unmute yourself and ask questions. If you run into any difficulties during the facilitation of today's lecture, please send me a private chat and I will handle it for you immediately. Tomorrow, Friday, April 21st, Dr. Cook will be sitting with critically acclaimed author Renee Watson for the annual Augusta Baker Lecture. There is an option to attend in person, so if you're in Columbia, South Carolina with us, I'll put the link in the chat so you can register, but we will be live streaming the event as well. So I will put a link in the chat if you want to register for the live stream, and you should look out for an email from me tomorrow morning with the Zoom link so that you can attend. Okay, now on to the good stuff. Our speaker today is Dr. Kate McDowell. Dr. McDowell is the Associate Professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the School of Information Sciences. She is the lead PI on the Data Storytelling Toolkit for Librarians project, which was funded by the IMLS. Dr. McDowell has been teaching storytelling for 15 years, serving as a storytelling consultant for 9 years, and teaching data storytelling for 6 years. She was the 2022 recipient of the Association for Information Science and Technology Outstanding Information Science Teacher Award. And she researches and publishes in areas of storytelling as information research, social justice storytelling, and what library storytelling can teach the information sciences about data storytelling. I told you all you are in for a treat, so let's all welcome Dr. Kate McDowell.
Thank you so much. And it is a real joy to see old friends, new friends, folks I haven't met yet. It's just a delight to be here with you. So we have a limited time and I want to make sure to leave time for questions because I am always at my best when I get to interact with my audience. That is my favorite thing to do. And it's what I believe storytelling is all about. So let me give you a brief sense of what we're doing today. This is our contents and agenda. It will be snappy and it'll be kind of light. I'll be going quickly, kind of dancing across a lot of different topic areas, but just know that in the questions, I can offer you more depth and I can also point you to some of the publications that would let you go even deeper. So we're going to talk about storytelling, data storytelling, and critical data storytelling as sort of a three things that interrelate with each other. I'm going to introduce to you this project, the Data Storytelling Toolkit, and some of the initial obstacles that we ran into that are part of what libraries run into when they are trying to tell their stories based on the data that they have collected. Then we'll get into some of the structure of the toolkit. We'll talk about the evidence and arguments approach. Then we'll talk about story structures, which are things that you can take away today and use for all kinds of applications. I'll give you the latest research we're doing, which is brand new, which is looking into tone and tactics for audiences, including audiences that are disbelieving or even polarized in their viewpoints. And then we'll end with some questions. I'll go through a few more resources for you, just in case you'd like a few more resources, because I am always first and foremost a librarian at heart. So how do we know about this thing that I'm going to introduce called storytelling, data storytelling, critical data storytelling? Well, first of all, let's go back to Augusta Baker, who was the first person to hold the position of storytelling specialist at the New York Public Library. I love this quote from Baker and Green, that the storyteller is, for the time being, simply a vehicle through which the beauty and wisdom and humor of the story comes to listeners. So it's about the story, right? We are serving the story. This is so different. This tradition, this professional tradition of storytelling is so different from marketing, from where we're trying to pull the audience to do something. We just want people to learn to read, right? And to engage with information. It's so different from business storytelling, where the idea is to kind of capture interest and keep playing that interest. We are in service of the stories. And I would say that libraries are in service of people. And the stories that we tell with data, with library data, should be in service of the fundamental ideals that libraries have. So up at the top, that's Augusta Baker. I did want to mention Carolyn Hewins in the fabulous hat, who was a groundbreaking woman in the field at a time when the field was 80% white men. She was a white woman who directed a public library. It was not enough, but it was a step toward more inclusion. And Betsy Hearn at the bottom right, who was my mentor and director of the Center for Children's Books for many years, among other things. I have also done 8 years of storytelling consulting, and I won't go through all of that here, but I will just mention that I was very honored to be asked to join a group, PAHO, which is part of the World Health Organization. For the last 2 years, I've been working with Ian Brooks, and you'll see one example of this later when we get to some issues about polarized audiences and misinformation. I'll talk a bit about that work. I'll also bring up, I won't talk about all these, but I'll just highlight for a minute the Prairie Rivers Network group, which I was honored to be a part of their 50th anniversary celebration, and to help them retool and refocus so that they could reinvigorate their membership and go from being an organization that was shrinking to an organization that now across the state of Illinois is a growing effort, and it has many members to support Illinois water conservation. I also know about storytelling from teaching data storytelling. About 6 years ago, I made this leap of faith, and I invented a new course with my colleague, Dr. Matt Turk, who is my co-PI on this grant. He has an astronomy PhD. He has a massive data background and has built tools for astronomers. I have a storytelling background, and I have been working on these consulting things for a number of years. And we brought those things together to create courses. We now have 2, and we're growing, in ethical and accurate information communication. We know that data is everywhere, and its growth can be just as challenging as its benefits. And there are new storytelling challenges that come with that. So our courses take those challenges on very directly. We want to acknowledge the flexibility of expression available, even when using data and story, while being first and foremost honest. And the whole teaching team is acknowledged there. So real quick in the chat, I would love to know your comfort levels. And this is just for my eyes, for our eyes together, to kind of have a moment of like, what are you most comfortable with? Is it data? Is it story? Or is it both? So you could put any one of those 3 words in the chat right now, and I would love to see that. Story. Thank you. Yep. All right. Got some both, got some data, got some story. Yep. Thank you. Yep. No matter which is your comfort zone, you are in the right place, because we will touch on angles from either direction and from both together. The important point here is to think about what story and storytelling really do for us. That's great. Thank you for those. I really appreciate that. It's just nice for me to see a little bit about you and who you are. And I'll have a few other reflection moments in this for you all. We know some things about storytelling from research that I have not done, research in neurology that has been expanding dramatically in the last number of years. On the left-hand side, we know that storytelling affects the brain by connecting us. There is neural coupling, there is mirroring that occurs. And on the right side, we know that we enjoy it. That's what dopamine is about. And that it activates a lot of the brain when we're engaged in storytelling. So it's really important to think about how we use storytelling ethically. This is how I define storytelling. I'm not alone in this. This really comes out of that 130-year tradition I was describing. Storytelling is what occurs when a story is shared between a teller and an audience in the kind of rich exchange that means that the particular version of the story might be different every single time. And yet, because a story can be comprised of informational and emotional components, it can be accurately the same story, a story based on data, an empirically true, valid story, a story containing the same evidence, and also be told in slightly different ways, depending on the dynamic process through which that story emerges in that connection. And this is something I could talk about for a long, long time, because it's not just that it emerges in that connection and the story, it's also that the audience has vantage points on things like the connection between the teller and their story. How do you know your story? The audience is always asking themselves that. The teller has ideas about how the audience might be connected to the story as well, right? So this is a three-part triangle that in some ways has at least 6 parts and maybe more even than that. But briefly, that's how I define storytelling. And it's very much in alignment with our tradition in librarianship. So data storytelling, the way we define it for our purposes in an information school where we are bridging different fields. I teach students in every degree program that we have, undergraduate to master's degrees and PhD. Data storytelling means any presentation of data using narrative strategies in story form. So I'm not going to be able to today do a workshop for you, but I'm going to skip across the top of some of the things that you might need in order to do some of this work yourself. Okay, so when we start to think about data in story form, the idea is often this. We've got all this data, it's symbolized here by a pie chart, which has its pros and cons as a representation of data. And we got to get it out there, right? We've got to produce it in some way that people are going to hear it from us. And then once they hear it, they'll do something different, right? Well, if you've been anywhere like I have been, like talking with, say, academic librarians who tend to be in the middle of organizations, it's not just that you need to be able to put data in story form, it's that you need to be able to do this. You need to be able to get your data into a form so that the people who hear it from you retell it again, because that is how advocacy is effective. It's not just telling the story, it's making sure that people can retell the story. So the story has to be accurate and it has to resonate with those shared values that are what a library is supposed to do in the cases that I'm talking about. But it could be a lot of different things. I mentioned Prairie Rivers Network and their 50th anniversary. This was a story that they developed trying to think about how do we get people to understand that rivers aren't just highways for boats? This is complicated because rivers are also highways for boats, but they're not only highways for boats. And in treating them like that, unfortunately, training of rivers has tended to destroy wetlands that help to make water what it is: clean, pure, drinkable, usable. So this was a story that I worked with them on developing, and it's an example of where data, where information and emotion come together. I'm skimming over the top of this. If you want to know more, let me know. This is the graphic that they ended up developing for their 50th anniversary after we worked together. And I really, one thing I love about it is the way that it is a river. It is a river that flows forward and backward, and you can see the actual rivers in Illinois branching off from the river of the history of Prairie Rivers Network. So story in this case is implied as a visual of we keep going, right? The idea that we persist is really important in this kind of narrative. Critical data storytelling means advocating the stories based on data to make change toward equity and social justice. And here is where I think our shared interest in Augusta Baker and the legacy of her work, and also Dr. Nicole Cook's work, is front and center. And I just want to mention that this idea of critical data storytelling that I'm beginning to develop toward a book that I'm working on a proposal for right now is inspired very much by at least 2 sources and really many more. But Du Bois and D'Ignazio and Klein are some of the key people. And Du Bois's work, if you haven't seen this book, you absolutely must. It's just astonishing. The way that his work interweaves visual expressiveness and the accurate data about real humans living at the time under tremendous pressures of segregation, Jim Crow, what became Jim Crow in many cases. I just cannot recommend this book enough. So this is a little excerpt from a book by Snyder called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And the reason why I think data storytelling is maybe more important right now than it has been for a while is the way that institutions are needing defending at new levels and in new ways. Institutions don't defend themselves. I know this in part because I went to the undergraduate college, New College, that was a public undergraduate college in Sarasota, Florida, that is being turned by Governor DeSantis into a public Christian college modeled on a Christian college in Hillsdale. The public is not all Christian. It's nothing against anyone who is Christian at all. It's just to say the public is not all Christian. Public institutions in this country were never meant to be from one religion. And my undergrad has been publicly butchered at this point. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that. It's really difficult. So defending institutions is why I'm here. I think libraries are under a number of different attacks in local places. I think book banning is a symbol of that attack, and I think those attacks will continue. And we're going to need data storytelling on our sides every step of the way to get through what this season of world history is bringing for us in the United States right now. So here's an example from one of my classes about, so data storytelling. What can a data story do for libraries? Well, it can contrast the richest libraries on the left-hand side that are purple with the poorest libraries on the right-hand side, and surface disparities that say, and I'm working from a grant program, I appreciate grant programs, but surface the disparities that show that grant monies tend to go to the libraries that are already the best funded in the state of Illinois. I would be willing to bet if you replicated this research in your state, you would find something similar. And not only did this student do that work, and I'm not crediting the student, I'm crediting them as a student, but I'm not offering their name by request to withhold it, because this could be seen as controversial and we all want to keep our jobs, right? But it was incredible research that they did about how this disparity impacts library patrons, where here is an image that tells a story. If you look at the north part of Chicago and the south part of Chicago, and you look at the disparities, check out those yellow numbers of 3 times more printed materials, more ebooks, 2 times more programs. Okay. So Nicole Cook and I have done some work on social justice storytelling. I'm going to breeze through this because you can read about it in the library quarterly. If you can't access that, please email me. I will find a way to share that with you personally. This is an excerpt from some work that Dr. Nicole Cook and Dr. Miriam Sweeney did earlier. And I just want to highlight that distributing information is in itself a political act. I never want us to forget that. So when we're distributing information, we have to do it ethically. We use an ethical framework in my courses that Dr. Cook and I are working on an article about expanding. We've proposed a panel at Elise this fall, if any of you will be at that conference. We talk about people stories, culture stories, and institution stories. So a person story, people stories, but let's talk about a person. If at all possible, you ask permission from a person to tell their story. If you are hoping to use a person's experience that is typical of the data you have gathered about your library, and you want to ask permission to retell that person's story to exemplify that work, the first thing you should do is make sure that that will not cause the person any harm. If you have even the slightest inkling that it might cause the person harm, then you anonymize that story, but tell a true story in relation to the data. We call it anecdata when people use an example of a person to be an exception to the data, and it doesn't follow any of the patterns, and it's meant to disprove that the patterns are real. That is not a good use of story or data. But if you're going to tell a person's story, ask their permission. The more context you give them about why you want to retell it, the more likely you are to have it be retold. Okay. So I've got to get to the DSTL, so I'm going to go through this more quickly than is even reasonable. But a culture's stories I cannot begin to cover right now. It is as complex as the entire world. We live sometimes in multiple cultures. We live at the centers of some cultures, on the peripheries of other cultures. It is very difficult to get permission. Authenticity is a construct that is basically about telling from inside to outside. But think carefully about who owns the story if you are putting yourself in the way of telling a culture's stories. And then an institution stories are between, and that's where I want to land. We need to get permission, and we need to be sensitive to the kinds of things that pertain to being part of a culture. In my case, a professional culture of storytelling, right? Okay, so distill the DSTL, the Data Storytelling Toolkit for libraries. I came to this by a process of giving a lot of talks to libraries about uses of storytelling and realizing that library data was getting stored a lot. And library data is not our collection process, right? It is actually for telling stories. So I came up with this phrase, library data needs story before storage. And I sat with that for several years. And as I worked with my way through what that meant, especially during 2020, when I had more time than usual to sit and think about what that meant, I started to think about building something. And so I started researching what would it mean to tell data stories for librarians. And we did, in total, it was about 90 interviews, 36 of them were of librarians. And then there were the questionnaire, ranking exercise, and workshop discussions. And we identified some real obstacles. I didn't expect to hit obstacles right away. I was just trying to figure out how libraries use data storytelling. And right away, obstacles came up. And I won't go through all of this, but let's just go to the takeaways here are there are two kinds of obstacles. There are emotional and attitudinal obstacles, fear of data on the one hand, because data has been used to punish us and to strip resources as well as to gain resources, right? So I just want to acknowledge that that emotion is reasonable, and fear of story. And I want to acknowledge that as well, because telling something true in a way that is memorable is not an easy task, right? It doesn't just arrive, it takes work. And the other kind of obstacle, which is a three-part that interrelates, is time, tools, and training. If we have time and tools, we might still need training. If we have time to get training, we might or might not get training on the right tools. Maybe we get fantastic training on these tools, but we end up not having time. These three obstacles interact in that way. So we decided to build a data storytelling toolkit for librarians. It's IMLS funded. We started in 2021, and then I was in a car accident and had to take a year to recover. So we are a year behind, but fortunately there's such a thing as a no-cost extension, so it should all be fine, and I am fine now too, which is great. We wanted to make toolkits for easy data storytelling for common data uses in libraries with a focus on public and community college libraries. Why? Because of defending institutions, because public and community college libraries are close to the ground. They're close to their voter base. They trustees may or may not be elected. It depends on the location, but everybody in our region is paying taxes toward the funding of those things. And that's important because that means that they're already invested by law, and they need to be able to see what their return on that investment is. And that's where data storytelling comes in. So we have a three-part plan. Very quickly, because I'll go to this later, that we recruited an amazing core design team. The opening webinar had 680 people register for it. I did not expect that in fall. But we ended up with, we planned about a 20-person core design team. We ended up with a 40-person core design team, and we've created a basic demo. And what I'm going to do now is walk you through some pieces of the demo from the perspective of what options are in the demo. It's a choose your own adventure kind of demo. So as you pick the pieces you want to add to your data story, it builds up. Phase 3 is going to be more public workshops. So I'm going to offer you ways to stay in touch before this ends. And the first way I'm going to offer you to stay in touch right now is I want you to have this. There you go. That's the website for the project. So if you'd like to know more, if you'd like to play with our early stage demo, remember, this is year 1, even though it looks like year 2, it's really year 1 of a planning grant. So it's an early stage demo, but I think we have some good ideas, and our mission is over here in case you'd like to look at that. And I will be making these slides available later. So we decided to frame this. First, we thought, okay, let's get examples of how people use data, and we'll build like 5 examples, one around like budgets for staff, and one around like budgets for circulation, budgets for circulation of collections and circulation affordances, right, or other kinds of library tasks. And it fell apart when we got to the qualitative research because there's so many possibilities for how data could work that instead we decided to work from an evidence, arguments, story structure basis. And then I'm going to give you a teaser on that audience piece at the end. Okay, let's dig into evidence just a little bit. What we began to realize is that when we start to think about library data as evidence, most people could really use some guidance on where to go for what kinds of questions. So we have these kinds of data. They're probably not all in the same places. They're not necessarily systematically connected, but we have community demographics from census data. We have community surveys, maybe, and regional food bank is a dream. Some food banks are able to do that level of data, some are not. But school district, yes. Park district, yes. They will have some data upon which they are basing their services, and we can compare and contrast in local areas in terms of what is happening there. And then service or program user surveys, so things where the library itself is creating them. And comparative data, similarly, we can look at state or national agencies' reports. There are some amazing public library tools for this. The PLA has Benchmark, ACRL also has Benchmark, but I will say I've been learning from our community college partners that they are so strapped for time that it's hard for them to even use that sometimes. Some places are well-funded enough, some are not. And then there are other institutions publish reports, whether it's trends or snapshots. So what we began to realize was that even identifying the kinds of data that might be possible was going to be something of an offering to our audiences. So this is just a thought point. What kinds of data do you have as evidence? And it's okay if you don't have everything I just listed on that slide, but I'd like you to be thinking about that, partly because if you want to ask some questions at the end and you have some data sources that you think might be powerful, but you're not sure yet, I would really love to talk about that. So like I said, not a workshop today. And in fact, what I'm going to offer you here, I was keynote for a talk that was sponsored by the Public Library Association last spring, February. And this is the link to that. It is freely available if you register on the ALA e-learning site. That link is to that. So I'm the first 20 minutes of that talk. That talk goes into some how-to, like a step-by-step how to take your data and make it into a story. I'm not going to try to cover that here because, like I said, I'm going to dance kind of lightly, and I hope in a way that will inspire you and that focuses on the Data Storytelling Toolkit. So let's go from evidence to arguments. So we realized that even having a guidepost to evidence was helpful. Okay, so what are the arguments? This took a year of qualitative research to come to, but I think we've come to some really good arguments. Rather than orienting around uses of data to justify, say, budgets for staff, which, by the way, was the most common by far need that libraries had, we decided that we would craft these 5 classic arguments and then test them with our core design group. And we'll continue to test and refine these. These have already been refined from their first iteration to understand the real needs of a community, to serve the real needs of a community, so that the library can compare well with similar institutions. And then and then these last 3, 4, and 5 are all comparative data based to build on existing strengths. So we know we're strong in comparison to other places usually, and to address deficits. Same thing. We know we have a deficit. Ice cube in the mouth, not intentional. We know we have a deficit when we compare ourselves with other institutions and see, oh, we don't have as many programs. We don't have as large of a collection. Those kinds of things. Okay, so the first thing the toolkit will do, and I'm just giving a very light overview of this, is to start to connect these classic arguments with the kinds of evidence you could use to support them. These arguments are fairly abstract. They can apply to a lot of different specific topics that you might be developing a story around. But you can see here that understanding requires some local community demographics. Serving requires local community demographics and something about the service or program use, right? Comparing well, you can go state or national, or you can look at other institutions' reports that are regional or local. Building on strengths, you need some kind of evidence of the strengths, usage rates, uptake, feedback, community surveys, all that. And deficits is similar, your comparative data for surveys and trends. Okay. So if you can imagine I'll go through this more later, but the toolkit will be a process of selecting pieces to build your story. And I'm only touring you through 3 pieces today. So far we have 6, but 3 pieces is enough, I think, to get a flavor for what I'm talking about. The third piece is going to be story structures. And over the course of my time teaching and researching and thinking about this a lot, and also just working with a lot of different audiences, I've come up with 3 structures that I think work pretty well. So the arguments also connect to these structures. So if you're going to understand the real needs, you're in a discovery story. You're gathering data, you're analyzing it, you're making sense of it, and you're presenting what you've found. That's a discovery process. The narrative interest there has to be like a mystery, and we'll talk about that a little more later. If you're going to serve the real needs, it's either continue to serve or change so that you serve the real needs. If you're going to keep up, same thing. It's either continue to keep up or change so that you're keeping up. If you're going to build on existing strengths, that's a change narrative. So then you're definitely talking about transformation. If you're going to identify and address deficits, again, transformation. Okay, so let's talk about these 3 story structures. I want to bring us back to, it's not just telling a story based on data. We don't sit by ourselves. Doug Lippman, who's a wonderful National Storytelling Network presence and wrote a great book called Improving Your Storytelling. He has said many times, it's not that we do not practice communication alone. We cannot practice this alone. We have to try our stories out and see what sticks, what works. We have to ask our practice audiences to tell us back what they heard from what we told them. Okay, so let's start from that premise as we think about that. It's the reason why stories are really interesting to me goes way beyond the use value for libraries. It goes to the ancient histories. It goes to sacred stories. It goes to everything about how a story persists over time, where there's a teller and a listener and a retelling, because we hold these things in our mind, these meaningful and memorable stories. We hold them in our mind and we tell them again and again and again. And through that process of reception, reiteration, revisioning, recreation, we end up with some stories that have really persisted for a long time. Now, I have done some work in narratology. It's not my only area, or I wouldn't be here with you today probably. But these three structures, continuity, transformation, and discovery, are based on narrative theories. But more importantly to me, and especially for our purposes right now, we have an intuitive sense of what they mean. If story is a fundamental information form, and I believe that it is, and storytelling is a fundamental information dynamic, and I'm sure that it is when we look at the stories that have persisted over long periods of time, then these are three story structures that they interconnect information and emotion. You know exactly what I mean when I say continuity. It means that it means that nevertheless she persisted. It means that we made it through something terrible. It means that the trauma didn't take us out. Maybe it didn't always make us stronger. I don't always love that, but we made it through. We made it through. That's a continuity narrative, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean we might be heroes of that story, or we might not be heroes of that story. That might just be something we want to tell about continuity for ourselves or our institutions. So transformation is the classic hero's journey story, and that people think of as a universal structure, and it's not. And that's important that it's not, because we tend to squeeze things into that outfit, and it makes it really awkward because people don't have a hero's story. The library is not a hero to people beyond those of us who are already deeply invested in libraries. It just doesn't work that way for other people. We have to tell our stories to outside audiences and get that feedback. But I think there's been enough feedback in my work already that I can tell you that we have to find a person who's the hero. A person, you can think of it as the person who experienced the outcome, the person whose life was transformed by the library. That's the hero, not the library itself most of the time. And then that discovery narrative being all about the mystery. We're trying to understand something, we're trying to find our way in the dark, and we want to get more information in order to understand where we think we are. Okay, these come from Transformation, Joseph Campbell, Hero with 1,000 Faces. And remember that his work was based on the lives of major religious figures around the world. Again, we are cool people and our libraries are amazing, but we're not the major figures of sacred traditions around the world. We're just not. That's okay. We're who we are, and that's good. Continuity is based on Tsvetan Todorov's ideas about structural analysis of narrative, looking at stability and resilience despite challenges. And discovery is a mystery kind of story. It's Roland Barthes kind of broke literary theory when he took a 60-page novella and turned it into a 300 and some page analysis. And it was sort of an end point of a certain kind of structuralist analysis. And but from this tome, SZ, Roland Barthes' work in the context of France, there's one of those 5 codes that he put together as the motivating factors for narrative, the Enigma code, that is the basis of that third theory. Okay, so let's talk about how it feels. Equilibrium. This is Todorov. This is continuity despite challenge. We're in a good steady state. Something happens and we're disrupted. And then there's a new equilibrium that's established beyond. You can think of pandemics as feeling a lot like this, right? At least looking back, it looks like things were okay before that, and then everything changed, and now we begin slowly to get into this new equilibrium that we're trying to establish now. The feeling, the way that it organizes emotion, is the sense of like there's a steadiness, there's a steady quality beneath everything. there's a major disruption, and then we return to a steady quality. That can be a really good narrative for talking about libraries that have made it through massive challenges, or institutions. The Prairie Rivers Network as a group is a good example of that. They had a real lack of membership at a certain point, and some of the folks who'd been instrumental in establishing it had kind of aging, on through, and out of this this limited existence that we have, and they really had a problem on their hands. So the narrative for them was, how do we continue? How do we establish some sense of continuity as an organization? And that might be the case for your library too. So the hero's journey, the classic, is a great story when it has these 4 elements and more. Campbell detailed much more than this, but this is a good summary. The idea is that we are telling a story about someone, often a person, who is making it over a mountain of obstacles, and somehow on the other side has managed to do something amazing. The feeling is that of awe. When it works well, the hero's journey story, the reason I think we default to it a lot is it just transports us to this sense of amazement that human life can even have these possibilities. It's astonishing. And that, when it works well, it works really well. It's like when Superman in the original movie, if you've seen it, spins the earth around counterclockwise or something, and it turns time back. I mean, it's so amazing, but it also can feel a little plastic if we misuse it. And that's why I use this figure for both. When people tell too many hero stories about themselves, you should keep your eye out for propaganda, because right now we have, according to the most recent Nobel Peace Prize winner, about 60% of the world's governments are under authoritarian regimes where we have individuals purporting to be the people who will take care of everything from this very top-down perspective. That gets propagandistic pretty fast in a lot of contexts. So it's something to watch out for. And it's something we want to avoid. We want to be careful with the hero's journey structure and not over apply it. Finally, the Enigma code. This is a very adaptable structure, but it's the hardest to work emotionally because you have to really think about your sequence with the Enigma code. And I'll refer you again to that PLA webinar that I linked earlier in the chat. The feeling is that we are on a journey of finding something out together. We're sleuthing. We are the detectives. We're detectives together, because what you do is you bring the audience into your process of coming to understand. We thought nobody was coming to these programs because nobody wanted story hour programs at night. But in fact, we found out that we hadn't publicized them well enough. And there's a whole bunch of families that only have time to come to the library from 6 to 8 p.m. on weeknights. And so we've got to make that work for them, right? So that process of sleuthing out what is real and what's gone wrong, this is what this is all about. And just to give it a little more even direct, the process is really that of inquiry. And my colleague Chip Bruce here is very inspirational. I know some of you know Chip. The inquiry process where uncertainty can be met with data to start, and then a question can be met with some kind of information, and maybe a mystery is even met with a solution. Aha, we can figure out how to do this better. That makes a great data story. So if you're thinking about how to remember these, all you really need to remember, you don't have to remember any narratology if you don't feel like that today. Won't hurt my feelings at all. What I'd like you to remember is this idea of continuity, transformation, and discovery. The cycle for continuity, the mountain for transformation, the flashlight for discovery. Okay, now the bonus round. So these 3 parts of the toolkit are really well developed, and I think they're pretty robust, and they're going to be the foundation of a lot of other things that we do. But I want to introduce to you some of the newest work. This is based on some work that I did as part of the group that I mentioned before with Dr. Ian Brooks, who is the director of the Center for Health Informatics here at the University of Illinois. I worked on this example of COVID misinformation that was about vaccines containing what some were calling a satanic marker. But luciferase is not only not a satanic marker, it's not even in vaccines, as you can see from the top piece here. In fact, it comes from a Latin word root meaning light bearing. And the similarity between luciferase and the angel devil named Lucifer from old stories is what sparked this fear. But the real story is that the enzyme luciferase is a natural substance and it's a normal part of the wonder of lightning bugs, right? So I got to help on this team. I wrote that text, and this team was a large group of international people. I don't even have space right now to acknowledge them all, but they are in the slide acknowledgements. At least the few who helped work on this particular piece of the project. We are still working on the Anti-Infodemic Virtual Center for the Americas, so expect to see more of that. But that's the inspiration for me for thinking about the trouble we have with audiences today. Audiences have attitudes, always. Sometimes we know our audience is pretty positive. Maybe you're a library director and you've got a library board that is pretty much on board. I mean, it takes a lot to rattle them. They're more or less game for whatever you propose. That's great. That's a great place to be. Negative, if you know they're negative, well, at least they're consistent. Then you know you can approach that. Mixed audiences have some positive and negative, but I think the new insights we're adding are about these polarized audiences. So I'm going to very quickly, I want to acknowledge our core design team because they are the folks who've been working this out with us. 40 librarians from across the United States. They've been in collaborative workshops for 1 year, no more than 10 hours for the year. I promised them that. We have a Slack channel too. We'll be opening this up again to public participation in the fall. So if you're interested, just I'll give you some ways to follow and stay in touch with me at the end, which is coming quickly. So real quick, positive, negative, and mixed audiences. There are some tones that you can take with these audiences and some tactics. So you want to be transparent and you want to build trust with a positive audience. In a negative audience, you want to model a calm demeanor in the face of an aggressive manner, and you want to find a point of agreement. What's one thing we can agree on? Mixed is exactly that. It's a mix of these two things, transparent and calm. And this is important. Don't overestimate the audience sympathy or take it for granted, and try not to polarize the audience yourself. We haven't really put that in here except with this piece down here that says, what is the actual issue, right? I think that part is key. Polarized audiences require a really complex set of tone and tactics, and they are becoming more common in the United States today as we increasingly have parallel but separate assumptions of what is real and standards for validity of evidence operating in our country. So the tone becomes calm, non-reactive, establishing a shared language and asking questions, maybe not of your audience that is polarized, because a polarized audience means that you've got at least some folks in that audience who are profoundly misinformed or actively disinforming other people. So you've got to try to figure out, why is this happening? Why this issue? And what do we need to have happen? We do not necessarily need to disabuse everyone of everything we've ever thought is wrong in their thinking. I mean, I hate to say that, because when it comes to issues like profound discrimination, dehumanizing language, I would love to do all of the disabusing possible. But when we're talking about a library board situation and the room where it happens, when decisions are being made, the reality is we've got to try to get one issue at a time through the vote, right? So the tactics are connecting with the goals. It's not personal. It's not a librarian agenda. It's a response to a real need. That's where your community data comes in. You want to research the counter arguments, popular misinformation, provide evidence and stories that address those misconceptions. And this is the key piece of a lot of these decisions for funding, for libraries, for budgets come down to, there's a room where it happens, to quote the musical Hamilton, there are people in that room. You got to focus on winning over the voting majorities and stay the course, which may require consistent reinforcing of message in a way that stays calm and non-reactive. So this is the newest piece of the toolkit, and I think it's coming along. It's not fully developed yet, but you can see the direction we're going. This is a snapshot of the more full process, and it's actually not even the whole full process. I'm just realizing it's missing a step. So there'll be an argument, what you think you want to argue. The evidence, this is the part where the user has to, we have to go through and really understand, explore, analyze. Does this evidence support the argument we're trying to make? We've got to get that clear before we go any further. There's the motivation. Why are we trying to make an argument? If we want the budgets for staffing to increase, then that has to be built in some way to the evidence that we present. Maybe you need to have a red line beyond which the use became untenable for the librarians who are currently, or the staffing that you have, the mix of staffing you have, where it became currently untenable. And so how much new staffing do you need to bolster to that next level? I was just working with a group on this week. You've got to think about the audience attitude. All audiences have attitudes. You may or may not know them. You try to know them as best you can. That's a piece where I think we have more work to do. And then, of course, your narrative strategy, your story structure, and the data and the ideas for data being important. And eventually, we're also going to be adding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I guess I do have 6 there, similar success stories. And we'll have a couple of different branches for this. So I could probably talk more about this, but you don't need to hear me do that now. I do want to say that the long-term vision for this is to cultivate data storytelling as a signature expertise of our field, by which I mean library and information science, but all of the information sciences as well, so that when communities have data storytelling needs, they are met at libraries and by librarians. So I want these tools as a bridge to this bigger vision, which is a much longer term. Exactly. Thank you, Sandra. So I will say the only reason we didn't include school librarians is because it's harder to get at the needs. We can do, they're more mediated. There are more levels of structural mediation. Exactly. Yeah, but public and community college, you can see how community college pulls in 2 directions. And one of them is school library and one of them is academic library, especially for smaller, less funded academic libraries. It's where we're focusing on the folks that have the greatest economic needs. We're going to be at ALA. ALA promoted the conference recently. It was before March 31st, and I was really blown away to see that the Data Storytelling Toolkit for librarians was on there as a thing that you could go to. And if you're going to be in Chicago, you can go to this. And I will now copy and paste that into the chat for you, because I'd love for you to be there. And if you were here and you get there, please say hi. It would just be fantastic to connect. So that's the direct link to that session of the conference, not the whole registration thing. I just want to make sure that you know how to find us. A couple of other resources. If you're coming at this, my story folks who really aren't up for data right now, I want to say to you that I think there's an opening for you to get more comfortable with data if you think about more playful resources. If you haven't seen this book before, it's a series of postcards between 2 friends. And they gather data, they choose a topic, and then they gather data about their lives. I love it too. They gather data about their lives and they draw that data on postcards and mail them to each other. And so the whole book, it reads in a fascinating blend of, oh, fantastic, that's great. Yeah, it reads as a fascinating blend of the story of a friendship and the story of data in everyday life. And the story, and in a way, what I find interesting is there's a lot of inspiration for how things could be hand drawn. So let's say you do not have time to work on Tableau as a tool. Welcome. Many of us don't. I think that, even in my work as an administrator, Excel was most of what I did, right? I didn't really have time to work with Tableau, honestly. I just didn't have time. I had to solve problems. I was assistant dean for student affairs. I was associate dean for academic affairs. There was no way I could also learn Tableau in my spare time. This helped me a lot to think about what are some creative ways that I can get past the obstacle of, I know what the data is and I can understand what I think it should mean, but I don't know what to do except draw it out. And then I learned I could draw it out and share it with colleagues who were better than I was at making things digital and visual. And this is part of how Matt Turk and I started working together. Is Matt's really good at making things visual. He's runs a data exploration lab at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications here in Illinois. So that's for you guys who are feeling like, I'm a story person, I don't know if I want to approach data. Data is my discomfort zone, and that is legitimate. We found that in our research. This might help it be more of your comfort zone. For those of you who are really familiar with data, this is a fascinating book for you because it might challenge you to think about counting and what counts. This is critically important when we're talking about issues of social justice, where the categories themselves have a tendency to discriminate so that you do not see certain kinds of information about people's experiences. Numbers are really not more real than other kinds of data. But in order to count, we have to count. We have to decide what counts. And so this requires creativity because of the ways that there are so many systemic biases built into every standard data source that we encounter. And so we have to think about creativity in those ways. How are we going to get the real stories of our communities? It's not going to be the census data alone. It just won't. You're going to have to find more than that to do. And then also integrity. What is real about our communities that we can document with data, with things that we can count? And also, what do we make count? Because a lot of that power is actually in our hands when we are thinking about what kinds of stories we're going to tell accurately, honestly, in well-evidenced ways with data. That is it. And I have actually done what I wanted to do, which is leave about 10 minutes for questions for you all. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to put in the chat a few other ways that you can connect with me. I have been actively more and more using LinkedIn. Cool. And so that's a way you could follow me, connect with me. I'd be more than happy to connect with you there. I already put the website in, but I know a few people came in late, so I'll just put the project website here. And I have my own Twitter account, and there's a Twitter account for the project. So let me do the Twitter account for the project first. Twitter is a real mixed bag these days, you guys. It's been a weird day for news on that front, hasn't it? Sad and tragic and just odd. Anyhow, that's the project. This is me. And then finally, and I put it as finally because as much as I, who doesn't love email? I love it too, but I'll be honest with you, in some ways it is a deluged environment for folks like me, and it's hard to prioritize. So that is my email. You're more than welcome to email me too. I will do my best to get back with you. And I would love to hear your thoughts, questions, anything at this point. I think I won't, oh, Kat, awesome, wonderful. All right, data waitress, we're going to talk about that real quick. I just want to say these slides will be available to you. They have my references, they have image credits, they have more by me and my collaborators. And I just want to acknowledge some of my most important collaborators that have really made this work possible. And I'm going to stop sharing so that my face can be with you more. Kat, let's start there. They just want numbers, right? Yes. So I do have tips for you. I think the tip, this is tough, the tip is to try to make the context visual for people. I understand that if you could just tell them, no, but you don't have this whole story yet, right? Then you would be able to say, give me half an hour to explain the context to you. Probably can't do that. So how can you make the context visual? Here's an example I gave the other day to some folks who were trying to explain that staffing, one staff person does not equal one staff person, right? I said, visualize a person and what percentage of their time, fill their little outlined body up with what percentage of their time is spent doing their primary job, and what percentage of their time is spent doing their administrative job, and what percentage of their time is spent doing the connecting work that they have to do by going to different meetings. There are some people who, let's take student advising as an example. I'm in a university. Some people who are advisors who are really administrative advisors who are only doing maybe 40 or 50 or maybe 60% of their time as advisors, even though they look like an advisor on paper, they're really coordinating for programs and doing things like helping international students get through hurdles to study in the United States. So Kat, I don't know if that example is relevant to you, but it's thinking about, can you use another visual frame and make it visual if at all possible? People want the numbers, but you serve them up the context too in a visual way. I think that's a really key thing here. And be careful about letting other people tell you how to visualize your data. I would say, Kat, one of the powers that you have that might be, especially if you're feeling like a data waitress, and boy, do I feel that. I worked student affairs, so I don't know if you know how lowly ranked that is in universities sometimes, but yeah, I do know what it's like to be undervalued. I also was a public children's librarian, so been there. I think it's insisting that you have context, and if they can't hear it, then make them see it. That's really what I'd say. Monica, so nice to see you here. Process of presenting data storytelling to libraries. Yes, I have noticed some of that resistance or skepticism, but I will say that people, here's what I like to say to audiences who have that question. I don't know if you've heard me say it before or not, but other folks won't have. What I like to say about misinformation as it hit with the 2016 election and with COVID is that a lot of folks in the information sciences were just really surprised that people would be telling non-factual stories. Well, I was a children's librarian. I read all these fantasy novels, and I've watched 3-year-olds learn what story is. They make up stories all the time. They confabulate. They consistently it's a human thing to make up stories, especially when we don't have enough information, especially when we don't have data. It's a very human thing, right? So I don't want that to be shunned as something that is bad or wrong entirely. It's more about addressing people where they are. Because where people are, that where they are, that's how you start communicating, right? It's not that you can. So what I found is when I say a lot of my colleagues were surprised by misinformation, and I wasn't, because I've met 3-year-olds, there's been a new respect for children's librarianship when I've started telling that version of the story, because human minds are human minds, and narrative is narrative, and it's complicated. Sue-Ann, boy, I just love that comment that you made. And I want to tell you that is why we're building this toolkit. This is the first year of the planning grant. We're about to enter the second year of the planning grant. We are going to have a functional toolkit by the end of the planning grant. It will not be the whole thing. We're talking with Public Library Association benchmark staff about the possibility of building out 2 branches. One is the create branch, which is most of what I've been showing you today. The other is the explore branch, which would be built on PLA benchmark data and would choose some examples so that people could explore that data in relation to these narrative and story structures. So Sue-Ann, you are not alone. And that is a lot of what we're trying to do. That time, tools, training, triangle of problems, that's part of why we're doing what we're doing. Yes. So Sandra, I love how that's great. I mean, I've enjoyed your work for so many years. Yeah, exactly. Represent the job description, compare the 2 visuals, right? And that is something we do not do enough, and we often don't have time. I mean, in reality, we often don't have time. But when we're talking about communicating to the folks who might be able to control, I really do love that idea. I'm gonna put a heart on it. We're talking about communicating to the folks who control the budgets. Sometimes it is a matter of just making it very clear that just because there's a person in the role doesn't mean that that person is 100% in that role. And also there are things like there might be a standard number of, I would too, Joyce, it's a great idea. Yeah, there might be a standard number of people who are thought of as being served by a person, but if that person can't serve that many people because they have these other jobs too, then we haven't really fully calculated what the needs are. Most of us are up against impossible circumstances in terms of the level of expectations and the level of staffing. Yeah, I think, Joyce, there's so many interesting tools out there, and I am fascinated. I show my students ChatGPT. I've shown them automatic slide generation kits. There are things out there now that use AI to generate what I think of as like the status quo, right? I'm not that interested in the status quo, because the status quo right now in our country, if you try to find the middle, you're going to have to go to some areas of political space that I have very deep concern for our public well-being and for the stories we're going to have to tell ourselves about what we've been living through in these times. So I'm interested in library advocacy. I'm interested in the advocacy. I want that advocacy to be politically accessible. I don't want it to be that it's only one point of view, because that won't work. The public should be a bridgeable space, but it's going to take work because those bridges have significantly broken down. And we're all able now to look at social media and these things to say, that's key to the problem. Thanks, Monica. But yeah, it's we're in a tough time with some of these things. Yeah, so I think I don't see anything wrong with playing with all the tools available. I really don't. Any last questions, thoughts before we wrap? I know we were like 1 minute. Yep, Amanda, I will. And so I'm going to give those right to Sierra and right now. And so whenever folks have time to do that, you'll have those. And thank you, Joyce. That means a lot. The inspiration is definitely. Oh, fantastic! Thanks, Richard. That's great. I really want to be inspiring people to take what we know, 130 years of storytelling. I'm here to tell you there is no other information profession that has that background. We have something really extraordinary here. And if we can build on what Augusta Baker herself spent her whole life doing, really, if we could build on that, then that is Yeah, oh, it's just so good to see you all here. Thank you for being here. I think that's really what I want to conclude with is thank you, thank you, thank you. It is a joy. I feel incredibly fortunate to be able to do this work. Ellen, Brian, hey, it's good to
Thank
see
you
you.
so much, Dr. McDowell, and thank you everyone for attending. I do want to drop the link for the sign up if you want to virtually attend Dr. Cook's session tomorrow with Renee Watson. If you're in Columbia, come. I'll be there, so it'll be nice to meet you all. But please come virtually, sign up to attend virtually. I'll send the link out in the morning so you can all catch the live stream. I want to thank Dr. McDowell again for lending your time and talent with us. This was amazing. I learned so much as a PhD student. And it's been an honor to work with you. And I want to thank you all for supporting the diversity series this season. We had an amazing season, and I look forward to seeing you all again when we do critical conversations next season, and then we'll do this all over again. So thank you. Look for an email from me in the morning with all this good stuff, the slides, the links, everything. I'll be in y'all's inbox in the morning. Bye.